So the KKK is apparently distributing flyers in urban low-income neighborhoods that say deport yourselves and even offering to help. And so we're taking a break from Sunday Bible study today, and today we're going to talk about Southern nationalism. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Naomi, and this is Mosaic in Progress. So I have mentioned in previous episodes that I was raised by Southern nationalists. And I am taking the approach with this episode that we've been doing with Sunday Bible study. And rather than debunking things or talking about how I got out of it, today we're just going to talk about what they believe, because I was raised on this. It was my bread and butter. So let's get into it. We hear a lot about Christian nationalism today because it's dominating our culture. I am of the opinion, and it's an opinion, it can certainly be wrong, and you can certainly disagree, that you cannot have Christian nationalism if you had not first had Southern nationalism. Because a hotbed of Christian nationalism is, you guessed it, in the South. And Southern nationalism is basically the same thing as Christian nationalism, just without the American exceptionalism. You have to take it way, way, way back to get into it, how it began. So, Southern nationalists do not talk about the Civil War. They talk about the Second American Revolution. They talk about the War for Southern Independence. They talk about the war between the states. Very few Southern nationalists will call it the Civil War. And they're very specific about the reason why. Is that a civil war is a fight between two different parties, factions, however you want to put it, for the control of government. That is not what the American Civil War was about. The southern states seceded, and to be fair, if you believe that America had a right to declare its independence from Britain, you cannot really say that the South had no right to secede. Every people and party, regardless of whether you agree with the reasons for it or not, should have the ability to leave. Whether it's a person leaving the country, whether it's a person leaving a relationship, whether it's a group of people in a geographic location leaving a government and starting their own government, people should have the right to leave. This is part of, the right to assemble. It also means the right to not, if you have the right to assemble, you also have the right to not assemble. You also have the right to not associate. So, the South seceded, and I think it's very important to discuss the reasons for that, because there is the overwhelming belief in this country, for the most part, Civil War was about slavery. And you're not exactly wrong for saying that, but Southern nationalists make a point of specificity about this, that it was not about slavery, it was about states' rights. It's important to remember that prior to the Civil War, the South was much more heavily taxed than the northern states because of the way different tax rates were for different types of industry, and the South being primarily an agrarian economy with exports of raw goods, cotton and food and things like that. They were much more heavily taxed than the industrial states of the North. And they didn't think that was fair. They also didn't like the fact that their primary source of income, their economy, their agrarian economy that was dependent on slave labor, was being, one, taxed more heavily, and two, deemed immoral by states that were benefiting from it. And so they got to the point they were just sick of it. They were sick of the heavy taxes. They were sick of being told that they were immoral reprobates for owning people. And so they just decided, you know what, we're leaving. This is enough of that. This great experiment has been so special for us, but we're done. And the loss of income from the taxes from the South was too great a burden for the rest of the country to bear. The South was essentially providing the majority of the income the country was bringing in through taxes. So they couldn't stand for that. They had to get them back. So they thought the best thing to do would be to declare war on them and force them to come back. And not everyone in the South thought slavery was a great idea. Not everyone in the South owned slaves. However, at this point, it became a join us or die kind of situation, much like the American Revolution. Now, there were Southern people who fought for the North, and there were Northern people who fought for the South, because it was not an across the board, everyone in the North thinks slavery is awful, and everyone in the South thinks slavery is great. There was a lot of mixing of ideologies on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. And there's a point that needs to be made when making a discussion about this. When you want to say that the war was about slavery and the North was fighting this as a moral war. No, they weren't. The people who lived in the North, or the Southern people who didn't support slavery, were supporting a moral cause that had, in one sense, nothing to do with the war. No one in the North who made the call for war to happen was like, we got to stop these people. They're hurting Black people. Look at all these people who weren't free. We have to make this call. No, it was because they lost tax dollars. It was because they lost tax dollars, and they wanted that money back, and so force them to come back. The irony of this is that there were no structures in place to replace slave labor or to continue with the same output and the same income generation without it. And so forcing them to come back in just forced impoverished, burnt, war-torn states to come back in that had very little left to give to the North. But I digress. My point is that much like the issues of today and the issues of the last generation and throughout history ad nauseum, the people who were just living, who had opinions on moral issues, saw the issues as a moral issue and they supported it for moral reasons. The people who were pulling the strings and pushing the buttons and giving the commands only cared about money. And this is very important to remember when you think about the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was not the catalyst for war. It was not issued soon after war. It did not precede the war. It did not precede secession. In fact, it was issued, if memory serves, 2.5 years into the war that lasted about 5 years. And the reason that I point that out is because it was issued when the North was losing the war. So what is the best way to tear apart a country that you cannot beat their army. Just put utter chaos into where they're at. And so the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and the already war-torn South was suddenly in more chaos than it already was due to the war. And I want to pause here, and I want to very strongly iterate that I am no longer a Southern nationalist. I don't believe in the things that they believe, and I want to make that very, very clear, because I'm speaking about this as I was taught it, so that you too can understand the perspective. Again, as I am doing with Sunday Bible study, because whether you want to convince someone that they're wrong or whether you just want to know your enemy, there is a lot that I hear about Southern nationalists that is very reductionist or simply not true. And I think it is important to understand where people are coming from. If you're going to fight someone, you need to understand who you are fighting. And reducing them to ignorant racists is just dehumanizing. And why are you even fighting? And I mean that quite genuinely. What are you fighting? They dehumanize us. Okay, we're doing the same thing, so I guess you've got a step up and some moral high ground where you think it's okay to dehumanize people for whatever reason. The dehumanization of people based on an ideology is the reason that the world is in the state that it's in. And it doesn't matter what the ideology is. If you dehumanize someone because of what they think or believe, no matter how abhorrent that thought or belief is, you are contributing to the problem. Looking at them as a person who needs rescuing from their horrible thinking is a much kinder way to change the world. And if we had done this for a long time, instead of laughing at people who are different than us, then maybe we wouldn't be in the state that we're in now. So, 10th Amendment, states' rights. Which is a big thing you hear from Southern nationalists, that the entire point of the whole war was that the 10th Amendment guarantees that states have the right, states get to make the decisions about what goes on in the states. And many, especially in the South, many conservative right-wing type groups and politicians like to talk about this as a way to combat whatever it is that they don't like that's coming from federal government. Well, we can use states' rights. They don't have a right to do this. It should belong to the states to decide this. And I'm going to pause here because we're talking about Southern nationalism, but we really have to bring in the Christian aspect of this to really make this make sense. Because it's very easy to look at this and go, slavery is immoral. Why would you think it's okay to own a human being? How can you be a Christian and believe that? Well, I'll tell you, the Bible doesn't condemn slavery. In fact, it does the opposite. It tells you how you're supposed to treat your slaves, and nowhere in there does it say, free them. There are very specific instructions given to slave owners in the New Testament. Not the Old, the New. Well, the Old too, but there's a lot of things that are in the Old Testament, and people argue about that, well, you're a Christian. Why is it not in the New Testament? Why are you following that? It's in the New Testament. Very, very specific instructions given to slave owners and to slaves on how they are to treat each other. That slaves are supposed to work for their masters as if they were working for God. And that slave owners are supposed to treat them with kindness. and understand that they are responsible for them in the sight of God. So according to the Bible, slavery is not wrong. It's not sinful. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's a sin. And this is what they will tell you. Just because you don't like it, just because it makes you uncomfortable, doesn't mean it's a sin. There was even an instance of a slave who escaped their master and went to one of the apostles, the Apostle Paul. Paul taught the slave the gospel, baptized him, and then wrote to his owner asking his owner to forgive him and also give him to Paul. An apostle asked for a slave to be given to them so that he could have his own slave. So the reason that I say this is because to make it a moral issue to people who are largely Christian, you had no ground to stand on. We discussed in the previous episode about the Bible. The Bible is the instruction book for life. If the Bible doesn't say it's wrong, then why would anyone think that it's wrong? So, we get through the war. More people died than ever should have died due to the war. Brothers had to fight brothers. There was, and I will say this, as a Southern woman and someone who grew up mostly in Georgia, regardless of your stance about anything that I have said, you cannot look at what General Sherman did and find any moral justification for it. His march to the sea, where he pillaged, burned, and raped, and I don't just mean raped the land, the entire way through Georgia, is morally reprehensible. Because he wasn't fighting armies. He was destroying villages. He was destroying homes. He was raping women, including slaves. There are so many accounts of them coming through and finding every woman of whatever color she was that they could and raping them. I was read by my mother a book called The Children of Pride and a book called A Georgian at Princeton. These were compilations of letters written by the Jones family. They were a Georgia family. I think they lived around Savannah, if memory serves correctly. And they wrote each other back and forth. This I think he was a Presbyterian preacher, but he owned a cotton plantation. And in his writings, he talks about how he thought of his slaves as family and he felt responsible for them and for their souls. And from the letters, if you can trust the letters, it seems that they were treated as family. Now, whether or not that is true, these are their own accounts of how they acted, that's up for debate. But I was read these books by my mother, and this was given as the example of how everyone treated their slaves. And that things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was fiction, were not an accurate representation. I was an adult before I found out that that was a lie. That it was simply not true, that the majority of slave owners did not treat their slaves as family, that they were very cruel to them. And finding out the horrors that they went through, I have no idea how long, just quite frankly, honestly, in mourning. for what they went through and for my ignorance and complacency in it, even as far removed from it as I was. And this is why I speak out now, because I was silent and complacent for too long, and I won't be anymore. So, looking at Sherman's march to the sea, people look at that and they categorize the entire war under that umbrella, and that was how they all were. Sherman was particularly cruel. And ironically, Sherman himself said that if the war had been about slavery, that he would have fought for the South and had absolutely no respect for the Negroes. I think that is important to note, that we have these things in writings, that many of the big players, so to speak, in the war who fought for the North or who commanded armies or were president were not actually these bastions of morality and just plagued with grief over the plight of the African people who had been enslaved. They really didn't care. It was all about money and power to them. Now, one thing that Southern nationalists will tell you about the Civil War and why it is represented so inaccurately, according to them, is that victors write the history books. And I think that is worthy of note. And it's an important thing to remember. And I think it's one of the few lessons of importance that we can learn from Southern nationalists, is that that is an important thing to take note of. Victors write the history books, which means if you are reading history books written by someone who won the war, you should question everything that is written and look into it further. Because they're always going to paint themselves in the best light. They won. Who's going to question them now? So, following the war, we had Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was such a poorly thought out process. And just absolutely poorly executed, that generations later, Southerners still resent it and talk about it like it happened to their grandparents or their parents. And one of the things that came out of Reconstruction, because with Reconstruction, the South was essentially an occupied nation, which is still how they think of themselves. Southern nationalists is an occupied nation. So they had seceded. The papers were signed when they surrendered, and so the Northern Army just occupied the South to manage things and run things and set up new governments and schools and stuff. And quite frankly, did a shitty job of it. Regardless of anything that was right or wrong about the war and the reasons for it and slavery and any of that, Reconstruction was an absolute abysmal failure. It is one of the reasons why education in the South is still some of the lowest in, just the worst in the nation. Because Reconstruction was a failure. It was shit. The soldiers were there to make sure they didn't secede again, basically. That was how they viewed what they were doing. And they didn't really care about the crime that was going on. And so the KKK was formed. It was a brotherhood of former Southern soldiers, Confederate soldiers. And they wore the hoods and the cloaks and everything to conceal their identity so that they wouldn't be arrested later by the Union soldiers. And they were basically a vigilante army who were going around taking care of the crime that the Union soldiers wouldn't take care of. Now, we can get into some details about the types of crime and who they were specifically targeting, but you already know that, so let's not get into it because you already know. After a while, they sort of disbanded and went into the shadows and then resurfaced, ironically, who knows why, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement and integration. And Southern nationalists have such a hard time with this, explaining it away and justifying it, and they can't Sons of Confederate Veterans heritage their way out of this one. They get really uncomfortable. My dad, to his credit, and I don't like to give him a lot of credit, but to his credit, he said that the KKK disbanded sometime late 1890s-ish time frame, and because things were starting to get better after Reconstruction. And that the rebranded KKK that came out during the Civil Rights Movement were just racist people. They weren't the original KKK, they weren't following their mission, they were just racists. One of the few things he said that actually made sense, and especially considering he's a Southern nationalist, I have not heard many Southern nationalists admit to that. They don't like to talk about the KKK. It's too uncomfortable. They can't explain it away. But I think it's important to look at what happened during Reconstruction, and I would encourage you to read firsthand accounts about Reconstruction, the people who lived through it and what they lived through. And then you will understand, not justifying, but you will understand why so many white people in the South have so much resentment towards the people in the North, Yankees, why they still call them Yankees, and resentment towards blacks. Now, not saying it's justified, not saying it's okay, not saying they didn't bring it on themselves. I'm saying you'll understand where they came from if you read about Reconstruction in the South from first-hand accounts. This is why Gone with the Wind is such a emotional, pillar to people in the South, because it represents a way of life that they lost. The South was thriving prior to the war. They were exceeding the North in almost every regard. I mean, you can look at the industrial labor that was starting to take place in the North and the abhorrent working conditions of those working in industry, and it weren't much better than slavery, if we're being honest. Um, but no one was crying out at that time about the immoral industrialist the way that they were crying out about the Southern slave owners. They were the kings, so to speak, of the nation. They were the Elon Musks and Jeffrey Bezos and Donald Trumps of the nation. They were wealthy and they were thriving. They were sitting in their ivory palaces, and everything came crashing down. And now the South is a lower income demographic. They're a lower educational demographic. They are disrespected for things like our accents. They're a mockery. And so they look back on the time before the war with nostalgia for when they had power. This is why they do stupid things like elect a New York con man as president, because they think he's going to give them back what they had. The Southern nationalism mindset is that we are an occupied nation illegally forced into a union with the rest of the United States. That the northern states, the rest of the United States, that found their justification for leaving England over taxes became turncoats and decided that they could be forced to remain in a union because their taxes were needed. There is a lot of racism that is a part of Southern nationalism. There is a lot of ignorance that is part of Southern nationalism, but I think it is important to remember when dealing with Southern nationalists the underpinnings of their belief, which is that if the American Revolution was justified, then so was the secession of the South, because it was the same thing for the same reasons. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I hope this has been enlightening for you. This is a really uncomfortable topic for me to talk about. I was steeped in this to the point that my mother would talk in disgust about northern states and how she wanted nothing to do with them, and she felt like she had been tainted whenever she visited northern states. I went to Boston when I was about 13 years old. My dad traveled for business and he would earn points, and so sometimes after he'd earned enough points, he would bring us with him on trips somewhere that might be interesting and let us stay in the hotel, and we'd go sightseeing and stuff because we were all homeschooled. And it was a field trip, and my mom would take us to museums and historic sites and stuff like that. And I didn't fully get to enjoy being in Boston because of her talking about how disgusting it was and how awful it was, and people's accents were horrible and everything like that. And if I had a time machine, I would go back and I would ignore everything that she was saying so I could fully enjoy that experience and that culture and the learning that I could have had while we were there. But I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind as these people are finding their power and losing their fear of speaking up. This is where this comes from. So you either know your enemy now, or you have the knowledge to empower you to try to convince them otherwise of their beliefs. But I hope this has given you insight to where they're not some stereotyped, ignorant redneck anymore. Because stereotyping doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help you. It doesn't help the person you're stereotyping. It doesn't help the person that you think you're protecting by stereotyping. People are people and they are individuals. And the more that we realize that, and the more that we get to know the people who we want to stereotype, the better off we will be as a people. I love you all. I hope that this has been enlightening for you in some way. If you have a topic suggestion, please feel free to email it to me at mosaicinprogress@gmail.com. Follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, both Mosaic in Progress. And I hope you'll join me next week as we both continue to work on our Mosaic in Progress.